All right. Welcome to panel number 7, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I want to start by saying thanks to Anna Antich and Anna Toropova and to Peter Leese and to other colleagues at cultmind for organizing this wonderful conference, not just for the panels, but also the fellowship and discussions in the hallways. So thank you very much. Welcome to our panel, Therapeutic Pasts, Interdisciplinary Insights, otherwise known as the History Panel. Like other panels, I'm going to introduce each colleague, and then after they've all given their presentations, we'll have time for discussion. Our first panelist is Brian Feltman, who is from the Department of History at Georgia Southern University. He's the author of many articles on gender, trauma, memory, and the First World War. And he published a monograph that I would highly recommend, an excellent book called The Stigma of Surrender, German Prisoners, British Captors, and Manhood in the Great War and Beyond with University of North Carolina Press. He also recently co-edited a volume called Prisoners of War and Local Women in Europe and the United States. Brian's finishing a new book that I eagerly await that examines the visual and material culture of death and mourning in Germany from 1914 to 1945. And the title of his talk today is It Was All Mad, Civilian Internees, Cultural Production, and Barbed Wire Disease During the First World War, 1914 to 1918.
All right, thank you, Jason, for the great introduction, and I echo Jason's thanks for the conference organizers. The team at cultmind has done a really nice job here, so thank you very much. So I'm going to start today with a quote from Rudolf Rocker, who was a German anarchist who immigrated to the UK in about 1895, and so by the time the First World War broke out, he had been there for approximately 20 years. I'm no psychologist, but it seems to me that there is something quite wrong about imprisoning people who have done nothing, who have done nothing themselves to deserve such punishment. It was all mad. After all, a criminal expects to be caught sometime, and when he is sentenced, he knows more or less when he will go free. We had no idea how long the war would last and keep us imprisoned. The conditions of our internment were such that we were never free from anxiety about ourselves and about our families. It was all mad. Now, Rocker was one of tens of thousands of Germans who had immigrated to the United Kingdom in the decades leading up to the outbreak of the First World War. And as you can see here, by 1914, there were approximately 53,000 Germans living in the UK. And for the most part, these were men, primarily German men who immigrated, and they came to the UK and they made lives for themselves. They married British women. They had children who identified as primarily being British. And so when war broke out in 1914, the consequences of that conflict for them were almost immediately traumatic. With the outbreak of war in August of 1914, discussions began about whether ethnic Germans should be allowed to remain free in the UK. And the decision was initially made that German men would be allowed to remain free, but they would have to register. And so in August of 1914, you have the German Registration Act, but that didn't last very long. And following the sinking of the Lusitania, hit again here. In May of 1915, there were not only anti-German riots all over the UK, but really all over the British Empire. And Panikos Panayi has done a lot of good work in this regard, looking at this as being kind of a moment when anti-German sentiment hits fever pitch. And so following the sinking of the Lusitania, German men are no longer going to be allowed to simply be registered. They are going to be interned. And so the internment process, or mass internment, begins following the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915. Went backwards there. And this was an extremely traumatic event for Germans who had made their lives in the UK. For a lot of these men, internment meant that they were going to be financially ruined. They were going to lose their pensions. They were going to lose their businesses. And so a lot of these men chose suicide or attempted suicide rather than going into internment. These are just a few of the examples that I found in the press. Heinrich Hauck, for example, here. you have everything from dock workers to master hairdressers who are making the decision to try to take their own lives. And I'm happy to talk about specific examples later if anybody wants to know more about that. But and here are just some more examples of men who chose to take their own life rather than go into internment. For the most part, the Germans who did not commit suicide, which is an overwhelming majority, I should stress, are going to end up in one of the camps for civilian internees that were spread across the UK. Alexandra Palace was in central London. You can see a number of the smaller camps here. By far, the largest camp was the Nakalo camp on the Isle of Man. And even for the civilian internees who spent time in the other facilities, most of them would eventually end up on the Isle of Man. And so this was really the core of the civilian internee experience. Now, it should come as no surprise that on top of the trauma that was experienced with the arrest and internment of German civilians, the captivity added another layer. The men who went into captivity found that it was very difficult for them to find a place for themselves in the camp environment. And one of the major problems that Rocker talked about in my introduction there was the fact that they had no idea when their internment was going to come to an end. There was this feeling that they couldn't move on with their lives. They were worried about what was happening to their children, to their wives, to their business interests. And so these men started to develop what the Swiss psychologist Adolf Vischer referred to as barbed wire disease. And barbed wire disease, effectively, he tied specifically to men who were experiencing confinement, and they didn't have a sense of when that confinement was going to come to an end. And so they're all the kind of traditional things that we associate with depression. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of anger. A lot of these men acted out. They would try suicide by guard in order, like trying to escape, hoping that the guards would actually kill them. A lot of sexual difficulties that these men describe in their memoirs, and these symptoms of barbed wire disease were debilitating. And just to give you a couple of examples of the way that people discuss this in their memoirs, Paul Cohen-Portheim, who's one of the more famous internees who spent time in the camps of the UK, he was a musician, he said that captivity had an indescribably degrading influence on the soul of man. F.L. Dunbar Kalkroith, every individual had anxiety and distress enough to carry around with him. You just come to terms as best you can with the state of affairs and hope again that it will all come to an end soon. Where there is no aim, no object, there is no sense of time. And then Stobziada, which was a camp newspaper for Camp Stobbs in Scotland, said the danger in camp life is indifference, which takes possession of lots of people and does not let go of them. So prisoners came to understand that indifference was dangerous, and that if they wanted to maintain their mental health, that they had to organize, they had to give their lives purpose. And this was evident to them because the suicide attempts and successful suicide attempts continued in the camps of the United Kingdom. And here you see one tragic case, Hermann Kraus, who took his own life even as a British guard was close by and was not able to stop it. And it was virtually impossible to stop these men from attempting suicide because they used things like the same razors that they used to shave on a daily basis. And so it was really difficult to remove these dangerous objects from them. So what we see is that in order to give meaning to their lives, civilian internees started to rely upon community. They started to rely upon cultural production. Now, a lot of scholars have looked at the activities of civilian internees, not only in camps of the UK, but in camps around the world. And most of them have simply said, this is what these guys were doing because they were bored. Right? You need something to do every day when you get up. And so I think the real point that I want to make today, what sets what I'm saying apart from what others have said, is that we need to see these activities as something much more than just a way to pass the time. These were, in a lot of very serious ways, these were life-saving activities. They were therapy for these soldiers, and I think that we should discuss their activities in those terms. And some of the writing from the time confirms this. This is from William Howard Taft, many of you will know that name, who worked for the YMCA during the First World War. The real wonder is that so many have struggled so valiantly to preserve their manhood and keep their interest alive. In every camp, there were these unknown heroes who resisted the overmantling depression to the very death and put forth every effort to save themselves and their comrades. And so these heroes that Taft's talking about are the people who became the camp organizers, the people who set up camp newspapers, the people who started setting up camp theatrical associations and camp musical associations. Now, I could talk about this for hours, but I'm going to focus today on theatrical productions and musical associations. Okay, so the primary chronicler of camp theater during the First World War was a man named Hermann Pötzgen. And according to Pötzgen, there were approximately 33 civilian camp theaters in the UK. And so this was a widespread phenomenon. Very often the larger camps like Nakalo would have numerous numerous theaters. And so this was extremely important to the prisoners there. There was a lot of work that went into to coming up with a camp production. You needed set designers, you needed actors, you needed directors, you needed a musical component there. And so this gave people important work that they could do on a daily basis. And just to give you a sense, this is once again Paul Cohen-Portheim. The actors and next to them the musicians were the happiest people in the camp and certainly contributed more to the happiness of the rest than anyone else. If anyone doubts whether art is of real importance in life, a course in prison life might very quickly induce them to modify their opinions. And so this gave these men a sense of purpose. And when they talk about their activities, they don't just say, this was a lot of fun. They talk about how they are preserving their mental health for the future. They understand that there is a life after internment and that if they don't take care of themselves mentally, that they're not going to be in a very good position to take care of their families when the war is over. Another one of the favorite events for internees was the formation of musical associations. And a lot of the people who became internees had been in the UK, as I said, for decades. Others happened to be touring around. They were simply on vacation, or they were musicians who were, just traveling around on tour. Those people were also interned, and so there were a large number of extremely talented German musicians in London when the war broke out, to the point where in one of the camp newspapers it was said that during the war, without question, the best musical shows could be found in the camps for the German civilian internees. Once again, these musical productions were much more than just passing the time. As you can see here, for hundreds of the prisoners, a wonderful mental recuperation, which cannot be estimated too highly. So well attended that the proverbial needle wedged between the people would not have fallen to the ground. And so whether you're looking at the writings of the prisoners themselves or neutral camp inspectors, everyone talks about how well attended these performances were and how important they were. Here you see another example. This is from the Douglas camp on the Isle of Man. And I really like this quote. I think this says a lot. It's from a newspaper called DH, which stood for Die Hunnen. Music, the highest of all arts, which temporarily raises us far beyond the ugly barbed wire into spheres from which we look down with a smile on our bitter lot. That's where we fell. Iron bars no prison make. And so they talk about being raised up above the camp. This gives them a sense that they have a release, that they can move beyond that barbed wire that represents their wartime existence. And then just another example from Stobziade here. Nothing reminds us more of home than to listen to the songs which we were able to hear outside in the world in happier times. So, Building upon that, one of the things that was witnessed in the camps for civilian internees was a high degree of musical nationalism. German internees gathered on a regular basis to celebrate the Kaiser's birthday, January 27th. They celebrated the memory of battles of the past. They became extremely nationalistic, and as you can see, these are some programs. Most of these programs are available in the online collections of the Bundesarchiv in Berlin. But it came across as odd. When I've talked about this in the past, people say, I don't buy it. Why would a bunch of people who have spent most of their lives outside Germany suddenly become German nationalists? And I really thought about this a lot, and luckily I was able to go back to Rocker, who made observations on this. Rocker says, as you can see, what struck me among the other internees in Olympia was the almost hysterical German patriotism among most of them. It was grotesque. German patriotism was the last thing I expected from Germans abroad. He goes on to talk about how these men, for the most part, had been law-abiding shopkeepers. They had been good citizens in the UK, who had children and wives there, and they felt as if because of their Germanness, their lives were being taken away from them. To continue the quote, these poor devils had suddenly found themselves hunted like wild beasts, abused in the press, attacked by the mob. It created in their minds that perverted, exaggerated German patriotism which had puzzled me. They were being punished as Germans, therefore they had to justify themselves as Germans. It was their way of asserting their human dignity and pride against the humiliation to which they were being subjected. And so, to conclude, I think that it's very important that when people look at the activities of civilian internees, that they see these activities as more than a way to pass the time. The situation was different than I think you would see in some prison communities, because most prisoners know when they are going to be released. And just some quotes once again from the prisoners who commented on this. We know that anyone who hasn't figured it out yet and still playing Skat or Doppelkopf, 2 German card games, from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., has not only lost 3 years of his life. For him, captivity is not a matter of standing still, but of going backwards. And so good, hard mental work was seen as the key to mental vitality. If I rest, then I rust. And this is particularly true in the deadly time as a prisoner of war, which kills body and soul. It is therefore doubly welcome when prisoners who are condemned to inactivity put themselves under pressure in order to retain their complete personal identity and thus maintain their unweakened capabilities for activity after the war. So once again, looking forward to a post-war life here. And so in conclusion, once again, these were not meaningless activities for these prisoners. I think we should see them as therapeutic, and in many respects we should recognize them as being life-giving. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian, for the interesting analysis of a different site for analyzing self-therapy. I look forward to Q&A and further questions about that. Our next panelist today is Chris Sandal-Wilson, who specializes in the history of medicine from the University of Exeter. He focuses on the history of psychiatry, colonialism, and the modern Middle East. Chris's monograph just came out last year. His book is titled Mandatory Madness, Colonial Psychiatry and Mental Illness in British Mandate Palestine with Cambridge University Press. The title of his talk today is Politics, Violence, and Trauma in Mandate Palestine from 1920 to 1948.
Thanks, Jason. Can everyone at the back hear me? Is this mic picking me up okay? Great. Well, thank you so much, Jason. Thank you so much to the cultmind team, especially Amila, for all the work that's gone into organising this. And thank you also to the cultmind team for putting up with me for the last month. I'm really going to miss you guys. It's been really brilliant. So These are the questions that I had wanted to address in this talk. I was going to use this talk as a chance to think through trauma, its archives, its translations, its meanings in Mandate Palestine, in Palestine in the first half of the 20th century. This is a thread that is in my book on the social history of colonial psychiatry in British Mandate Palestine, but in kind of a submerged and dispersed way, and this is going to be my chance to kind of pull it all together. I'm hoping that I can still think through some of that here, but in the last week particularly, thanks in part to some tough love from a dear friend, and thanks also to the conversations that we've been having here at this conference about the value of the medical humanities, about who it's for, what it's for. I find my thoughts turning in a different direction. And so today what I want to share with you is something that I'm still thinking through and grappling with and deeply uncertain about, and I'm going to say it wrong and I'm going to get the words wrong, but it's about how I might connect the work that I've done as a historian and as a scholar in the medical humanities to the political demands of the present. Because thinking with Palestine and trauma today demands not simply passing acknowledgement, but rather a deep engagement with the present moment of genocide. And this is not least because the racist representation of Palestinians as a people deficient in their capacity for trauma is profoundly implicated in the ongoing project of their dehumanization, as the opening keynote and ensuing discussion made so powerfully clear. To return to another moment from that first day of the conference, this kind of engagement is necessary if we're going to begin to reckon fully with the question of sites, which is, after all, one of the focuses of this conference. What does it mean to think through questions of trauma, of pathology, of healing from the site of Palestine? For one thing, the enormity of death and devastation inflicted on Gaza by Israeli aerial bombardment, ground assault, and siege since the attack of October 7th has meant that long-standing critiques from Palestine of Western diagnostic categories have gained new, overdue visibility. In interviews and articles published in recent months, for instance, Dr. Samah Jabber, who's the head of the Palestine Mental Health Unit, has articulated with renewed force and renewed urgency critiques of the clinical description of post-traumatic stress disorder, critiques she and others have been making for many years now. Trauma in Palestine, she argues, is continuous and collective rather than post-traumatic stress disorder. Chronic or continuous traumatic stress disorder might be the more fitting description. And rather than attempt to ameliorate symptoms like hypervigilance, the more appropriate response, she argues, is to seek to establish justice, a call which reinvests trauma with the historical, political, and moral dimensions so often stripped out. Palestine under occupation has in recent decades been a key site for rethinking trauma, but the scholarship on Palestine and psychiatry begin to drift apart if we turn our focus to earlier decades. And so in the time that I have here, I want to try and bring them together for the mandate period, for the period that I've written about and have researched, in order to evoke certain continuities as well as ruptures with the present. And I want to stress here that I'm doing so in an unsystematic way as a kind of felt trafficking between past and present. And here again, I'm indebted to the opening keynote, and in particular how it heeded Fargo Tabaki's call to betray craft, to betray that which, to quote, pressures and pressures until what matters, what we need to say, gets pushed to the margins or disappeared entirely. I want to start in the past first, and before coming to trauma, I do want to say a little bit about the wider picture with regards to psychiatric thinking and sources. So across the first half of the 20th century, a range of distinct understandings and vocabularies of psychological distress and healing circulated in Palestine. What constituted psychic distress and healing would seem to vary greatly depending on where we look in terms of sources. Some of these vocabularies appeared to be very locally specific, and this is particularly the case if we look to folklore research. And I put a good example up here of a piece written by the Palestinian ethnographer Stefan Hanna Stefan in the 1920s, and he took as his starting point the idea that madness manifests in many different forms. So he begins by listing 31 Arabic terms used to capture these different shades of lunacy in Palestinian folklore, before continuing to say that the majority of cases were blamed on the jinn, on invisible spirits. If folklore research would seem to suggest a rich local vocabulary and set of understandings of mental illness in which supernatural agents played a key role, already by the late 19th century, the picture was changing. Scientific journals such as Al-Muqtataf circulated throughout the Levant, introducing and elaborating a naturalistic account of mental disease as a disease of the brain. The British occupation of Palestine in the First World War then, and the establishment of government mental hospitals in subsequent decades, did not mark the beginning of the history of psychiatry in this context. And I think this is a really important point. Palestinian and Arab engagements with the sciences of the mind long predate this. But by the Mandate period, a more restricted understanding of mental illness was operative in most contexts, in most of the cases that I've seen in the Colonial Archive, whether that's in terms of medical doctors, government officials, or indeed families. What transforms an individual's personal health problem or idiosyncrasy of behaviour into a matter of wider concern requiring some kind of response was the risk of violence or upset to the social order that they posed. And we see this again and again in the Colonial Archive. In the 1931 Census of Palestine, for instance, which saw an enumeration of the insane population alongside other infirmities such as blindness or deafness, it was only those who were actively, unmistakably, violently insane who should be counted. Government mental hospitals prioritised those who were deemed a risk to themselves or others, and families frequently warned of the dangers surrounding their relatives in petitions to the government, though it's plausible that how they presented relatives in this specific context was at least partly strategic, shaped by the hope of translating distress in a way that would unlock treatment, care and support. Although broad patterns are clear, drilling down into psychiatric classifications and etiologies at a more granular level is challenging, even when we look to kind of two of the staples in histories of psychiatry, patient case files and clinical research publications. With patient case files, the situation is particularly frustrating. Basically, no patient case file for any patient in a government mental hospital survives. It's only a small set of case files for criminal lunatic cases, mostly from the 1940s, that survive. In terms of published research drawing on clinical experience in Palestine, the source base is highly uneven and raises its own challenges. So on the one hand, there is the Hebrew language medical journal Harefua, which was established in 1920 and carried a number of articles on psychiatry, particularly somatic treatments introduced in the 1930s and 40s. On the other hand, there's the Journal of the Palestine Arab Medical Association, which only launched in 1944 and was forced to close a few years later on the eve of 1948. It published articles on malaria, tuberculosis, fertility, the history of Arabic medicine, but nothing on mental disease and or psychiatric treatment. And this imbalance has resulted in a historiography which can say a lot quite easily about European Jewish medical accomplishments in Palestine, while rejecting again quite easily the very possibility of a history of Palestinian engagements with psychiatry. And this archival asymmetry is something that I try and write against, but it's one that's deeply political and it's growing. Since October, libraries, universities and archives in Gaza have been destroyed, including the Central Archives of Gaza City, destroyed utterly by Israeli bombardment late in November. And Gaza's archivists and librarians have been repeatedly displaced, injured and indeed killed. And as every historian in this room knows, without archivists, without librarians, without our colleagues, the work of history is not possible. In the face of these archival challenges, looking at alternative sources and archives is necessary both to understand how mental disease was conceptualized and managed and to draw out the interconnections of psychiatry and politics in this context. And all three of the moments that I'm going to spend the rest of this talk touching on briefly, they all come from sources that are perhaps slightly unusual in the history of psychiatry. So the first moment I want to highlight comes from the 1931 Census of Palestine, which, as I said, included an enumeration of the insane population. Analysing the returns, the census superintendent Eric Mills offered the most extensive reflection on mental illness and its causes of any government official in this period. After dismissing alcohol, drugs and venereal diseases as the major causes of mental illness in Palestine, Mills fixated on what he called external shocks incidental to industrial life. While this formulation, especially coming as it did in the aftermath of the First World War, might lead us naturally to think about shell shock and other traumatic pathologies of insanity, what Mills clearly had in mind was not so much spectacular one-off shocks resulting from abnormal events, but rather the kind of grinding disorientation attendant on modern urban life, and above all, noise. So he writes, the noise of industrial countries plays their part in destroying the balance of the nervous and hence mental system. It's been said that if a dog, endowed as it is with the most acute hearing, were also endowed with the mental equipment of a man, it would be dead in a fortnight in an ordinary European city. And I'll come back to this animal comparison in a second. But in a sense, this overall way of thinking was very much of its time. By the late 1920s, the British Medical Association was also warning of a link between neuroses and noise. This way of thinking, however, was not imported wholesale without modification to Palestine. It became part of the explanation marshalled by Mills to make sense of the differing rates of mental disease recorded among the three putatively distinct religious communities of Palestine. So as you can see here, the census returns appeared to show that rates of mental disease were highest among Palestine's European Jewish population and lowest among its indigenous Muslim population. And for Mills, this neatly indexed each community's proximity to modernity, with all of its disturbing influences and pronounced sensitivities. Within this representational schema, the position of European Jews as the sole bearers and drivers of modernity in Palestine was reinscribed, and any legitimate claim to Palestine and to its future on the part of the majority of its inhabitants denied. This auditory Orientalism found its counterpart in the pages of the English language Zionist press at the time as well, where editorials assert a connection between sensitivity to noise and a high standard of culture. So here, external shocks, what I'm trying to argue is that these are folded into a highly political project of arranging Palestine's population hierarchically, with the right to nationhood reserved only for those at the very highest rungs of the ascent to modernity. But returning to this quote from Mills today, I'm struck by the animal comparison that those less disturbed by noise might be comparable to dogs. If it's a reminder that the dehumanization of Palestinians has a long colonial history, it also suggests just how far along in this process we are in the present moment. In November last year, after Israel bombed and rendered non-functional the only psychiatric hospital in the Gaza Strip, the general director of the hospital, Jamil Suleiman, told Al Jazeera, "Maybe if we were animals, then we'd have our rights." A second moment comes from later in the 1930s against the backdrop of the Great Revolt, and here I want to return to Dr. Samah Jaber's suggestion that chronic or continuous traumatic stress disorder might be the better fit for the Palestine case. Palestinian resistance to colonialism began even before the British mandate was confirmed in the aftermath of the First World War, but resistance reached new heights in 1936. Beginning with an unprecedented months-long general strike in the towns, Palestinian resistance grew into a guerrilla-style counterinsurgency in the countryside, which would only be suppressed in 1939 following a brutal British counterinsurgency. And against this backdrop, there was a dramatic increase in demand for psychiatric admissions, evident both within and outside Palestine. And I plotted that on this graph here. The spike in the middle is 37, 38, 39. Well, there are a number of plausible explanations for this. What's striking is that there's only one instance in which a causal connection is drawn between political violence and psychiatric diagnosis. And this case only becomes visible in the archive because the patient, Shafika, was admitted to a hospital outside the borders of Mandate Palestine, to the Lebanon Hospital for Mental Diseases near Beirut. And her return then became a matter of negotiation between hospital authorities and Mandate officials. And the story is a tragic one. So Shafika was reported to have lost her mind when her 7-year-old son was killed in an explosion in Jerusalem in 1936. After a year at home, she was examined by a doctor who diagnosed her as suffering from paranoia with ideas of persecution and other delusions in some way, he wrote, connected with the killing of her son by a bomb explosion during the disturbances. He advised the family to put her into a mental hospital as soon as possible, but with no beds available within Palestine itself, the husband made the decision to take her north to the Lebanon Hospital for Diseases instead. This wasn't an uncommon response to mental illness in the period, but in this case, Shafika's husband was clearly desperate because it quickly became clear that he didn't have the money to meet the hospital's fees. And so by 1942, the hospital authorities were demanding that the family come and return her to Palestine. Shafika eventually did return to Palestine, but there's one detail in this story that stays with me and which also I think foreshadows the continuous rather than closed nature of trauma in this context. So shortly after Shafika arrived in the hospital, the Second World War breaks out. And in the summer of 1941, the war reaches Beirut. Fighting came within a few miles of the hospital. A military order for the evacuation of the hospital is issued. It's only a last-minute ceasefire that means that the hospital staff don't have to kind of follow to obey this instruction. And we might well pause, although there's nothing in the archive that allows us to do this, we might well pause here to consider Shafika sent to the hospital to a place of safety and healing, a place of refuge, in order to recover from the death of her son in an explosion in Jerusalem, and now in the midst of another situation in which the noise was described as terrific and the bombing heavy. Shafika's experience, an exceptional archival survival from the past, appears the norm today. As Samah Jaber has put it in a searing critique of the category of PTSD from occupied Palestine, there is no post because the trauma is repetitive and ongoing and continuous. The third and final moment I want to touch on is an extraordinary document which survives in the Colonial Archive. It's a report from early 1947, authored by Dr. Mikhail Shadid Malouf, the medical officer who'd been in charge of the government mental hospitals in Bethlehem since the mid-1920s. The report was produced at the order of the Mandate government, who wanted medical experts to examine disabled wartime veterans with a view to finalising their compensatory obligations towards them. In November 1946. The first review of Palestinian cases takes place. In February 1947, it was Jewish psychiatric cases who were examined. And while Malouf agreed that these were all serious cases, in only one instance did he conclude that military service could reasonably be held responsible for their psychiatric condition. And this is, again, typical of the time. It's consistent with the low number of pensions granted by the British Army for psychoneurotic illnesses during and immediately after the Second World War. But even in this instance, traumatic thinking did not travel without translation to Palestine, and this becomes evident in relation to one of the veterans Malouf examined, Moshe. Moshe, Malouf recorded, showed signs of a lack of adaptation even previous to joining the army in 1941, and this was a judgment he'd made on other cases too. Yet it's Malouf's detailed account of Moshe's service which stands out. He had served in Palestine, Moshe that is, had served in Palestine and Syria before being sent to Italy in 1943, and while he was there he had been involved in detecting and removing landmines. After the armistice, Malouf's report continued. He went to Germany to look for his people, and in May 1946 returned to transit camp number 158 in Egypt, where his first mental symptoms became apparent. And it's this report and the detail in it that drives home what's really extraordinary about the wider process of review here. Here was a Palestinian psychiatrist evaluating the impact of the Second World War and indeed Holocaust on the mental state of a Jewish ex-serviceman on behalf of the British Mandate government. And it crystallises a moment of intense, intimate, and indeed painful entanglement, an entanglement which comes through in the archive again and again, and which to my mind characterises much of the psychiatric history of the Mandate period. This story of entanglement was to be profoundly ruptured just a year later with the Nakba or catastrophe of Palestinian displacement and dispossession, which begins in 1948 and continues to this day. Remembering this period in which entanglement was the norm is not to be nostalgic for an idealized or imagined past of coexistence, but it might be part of a broader project of writing back against a settler colonial erasure of Palestine and disavowal of a shared history, an erasure and disavowal which underpin the logic of elimination we see play out so horrifyingly before our eyes today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that new perspective on colonialism and psychiatry, such an important topic for the last few days that we've examined. I look forward to questions that you guys have for his paper. Our next panelist is Nathalie Egalite, who is a postdoctoral fellow in medical humanities at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine. She earned her PhD in medical humanities recently from the University of Texas, and her dissertation examined moral challenges arising from physicians writing and publishing literary texts about patient care. And she's continuing her research in this field. Her presentation today, which I very much look forward to, is titled Physician, Write Thyself on Cultural Ideas of Healing of the Mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So in this talk, I examine the use of narrative approaches in phenopsychiatry, focusing on one therapeutic intervention, the newspaper he founded and edited during his time in Algeria. So phenopsychiatry has been central to my own research, and I have interest more broadly construed in the ethics of narration and representation. So I've been very encouraged by what I identify as kind of a thread that's been woven in a lot of the presentations here at the conference, looking at the responsibilities morally of providers, what we as researchers owe subjects, but as well what we owe to each other as humans. So my analysis of Notre Journal, which is French for our newspaper, reveals Western ideas about the written word that were in many ways incompatible with the clinical realities of patients. So while there's a recognition that Fanon was one of the maybe pioneers or like a great contributor to what we know to be transcultural psychiatry, there's still a sense that he had certain kind of preconceived notions and biases that may have blinded him to the ways in which his use of writing and his use of narrative approaches were not progressive. And I want to call your attention to the fact that some of these ideas have become entrenched in medicine, and it's kind of a irony that they've been promoted by people that have been committed even to decolonizing medicine. So I'll begin by introducing Fanon as a physician writer, talk in more detail about Notre Journal, and then talk about some of the cultural misfits, or lack of fit, and situate that really in a kind of Western tradition. So Frantz Fanon, known as the Afro-Caribbean philosopher who theorized anti-colonialism, Black Skin, White Mask was his pioneering work on racism, the mental effects of colonization, as well as his own phenomenological account of Black life. Wretched of the Earth served as a sort of blueprint for third world independence movements. And as a physician writer, Fanon published about his clinical work in books and scientific articles, including literary representations of patients. Alienation and Freedom collects both political and scientific writings, and it includes his Notre Journal editorials, which ran from 1953 to 1956. So Fanon arrived in Algeria at the outset of the Algerian War of Independence. His goal was to transform the institution. And he was able to demonstrate, in part by writing about patient care, that psychiatry, as it was practiced, perpetuated colonial domination. For instance, revolutionary sentiments that were expressed by patients were labeled as mental disorders. His writing also details the social determinants of health the effects of social determinants on the health of his patients. Fanon ended up resigning. In his letter, he was deeply troubled and wrote, quote, "The function of a social structure is to set up institutions that are traversed by a concern for humankind. A society that forces its members into desperate solutions is a non-viable society, a society that needs replacing. The citizen's duty is to say so." So he advocated for social medicine and political liberation to improve material conditions of care. Now, as a medical student, Fanon was drawn to literature. He was drawn to history as well as like cultural anthropology, which are all narrative-forward disciplines. For him, biological and neurological aspects of psychiatry didn't provide a complete picture of how mental illnesses were manifested. Jacques Lacan, in his intersubjectivist perspective, were especially appealing. Madness could not be separated from the register of human meaning, including the realm of the symbolic. So psychoanalytic methods created space for the patient to make sense of what was happening. And narrating one's own illness from this perspective was essential. Fanon believed that having patients write allowed for a deeper understanding of the human psyche and the nurturing of key social relations. On the embrace of narrative in the therapeutic sphere, Fanon writes, "We must insist that the patients receive visits as often as possible. The patient's place in society and his or her family must be maintained. This is why the patient has to have a social attitude. Writing, receiving news, and narrating are some of the most important social activities." Now, Fanon believed a newspaper could be of tremendous benefit to the patients and the wider hospital community. Of note, Blida, the hospital where he went, was a second-line hospital. So many of his patients had been deemed incurable, and were coming to Blida after a second, as a second stay after initial stay in the capital's Mustafa Hospital. As well, the units were segregated between French and natives or indigènes. As well, Fanon was keen to replicate his accomplishments from a successful residency. He was at Saint-Alban-sur-Limagnole, where he worked with François Tocquel. Lewis R. Gordon emphasizes that Fanon wanted to implement social therapy as a humanistic approach to psychiatric medicine, requiring the integration of everyday life into the therapeutic process. And as well as Saint-Alban, Fanon championed the psychiatric unit's newspaper called the Trait d'Union, and he wrote several editorials. Now, the practical activities and skills developed from running Notre Journal were meant to make patients whole again. Fanon called it a process of rediscovery of the ego and the world. So it's firmly anchored in a kind of current of occupational therapy, building on Philippe Pinel's moral treatment movement. Asylums with newspapers were philosophically oriented to provide care through routine, rest, and order in a carefully controlled environment. And here I cite Louise Wanel. Benjamin Rice, in his study of the opal, argues that writing and reading were civilized, emotionally restrained activities in which the socially and intellectually elite spread their wisdom through print. Indeed, in the corner there, we have the Hydra, and the celebrated war poet Wilfred Owen published poems there and also edited it. So accordingly, critical assessments of such newspapers suggest that little can be discerned about mental illness or the experience of madness from the patient's perspective, and that they did not fulfill a caring function. So this appeared in the inaugural issue of Notre Journal, and Fanon, in an editorial, kind of outlines this rationale. On a ship, it is commonplace to say that one is between sky and water, that one is cut off from the world, that one is alone. This journal, precisely, is to fight against the possibility of letting oneself go, against that solitude. Every day a new sheet comes out, often poorly printed, without photos and bland, but every day that new sheet works to liven up the boat. So the newspaper committee would meet every Friday morning at 9:30 a.m. and plan each issue, and they would deliberate issues of style and form. The second year of the paper's run would see an increase in its printing capacity because they acquired like a genuine printing facility. Coverage in the newspaper included news and updates about just a wide range of activity, to name a few: the library, sewing rooms, workshops for pottery and basket weaving, film screenings, walks outside the hospitals, excursions to football matches, theater performances, artistic events, cafes, salons, dance halls, and the celebration of religious feasts such as Eid, Christmas, and public holidays such as the Bastille Day. Furthermore, the committee solicited reports from participants so that the newspaper could really serve as a forum for reflecting on the shared life at Blida. Fanon's editorials articulated a vision for how caregivers ought to treat patients. He used it as a teaching tool, combining guidance based on his own clinical observations, as well as reprints from lectures or conferences and training manuals. Discipline was a recurrent theme. When he talked about professional practice, he would admonish the ease with which orderlies would resort to punishment. And he educated them on the phenomenon of transference, which could occur when they were tasked with enforcing norms. He was very much attuned, which is uncharacteristic of the time, to tensions in the professional hierarchy. And he stressed the importance of cordial relationships between providers. This would help restore trust, which was sorely missing in the clinical encounter in the colonial context. So to transform these caring relationships, he wrote on changing how caregivers perceive their own roles. As well, he was open, talking about budget issues, conflicts, and areas of improvement. So the newspaper was really aimed at remaking a social order on the wards, and Fennell believed that to better the unit through the newspaper was conducive to patients' recovery. Now on cultural differences. I mean, regrettably, the newspaper had a really muted impact. So first, there was low readership, right? A newspaper in French was really ill-suited to Blida. Fanon and his colleague Charles Géromini summed up literacy levels on the Muslim ward as follows. Out of the 220 patients in our unit, only 5 knew how to read and write in Arabic, and 2 how to read and write in French. The others were illiterate. And in the first 6 months of the newspaper, only 1 Muslim patient contributed an article. There was also limited engagement from the wider patient population. So while there was no language barrier for the French wards, participation was lacking. It turns out skills in storytelling and writing were very difficult to acquire, right? Fanon had noted how patients in therapy not used to writing would produce monotonous and superficial statements, such as, "I thank the doctor for his good care," or "I would like to get out soon." So Notre Journal captured the interest of those already kind of habituated to writing, but it struggled to convert all patients into writers. As disclosed in the newspaper, during the last journal committee meeting, a delegate from the First Division surprised a large number of us. He told us that most of his comrades were in fact unaware of the journal's existence. Mr. Cohen's bitter observation is in reality the most severe criticism that can be directed at us. But it is productive because ultimately Mr. Cohen is on the committee and he has promised to open up our journal. So this speaks really to Fanon's willingness to confront missteps as a clinician. So Fanon would go on to learn from locals and to adjust his social therapy to reflect and promote culturally appropriate cares. He appreciated, for instance, that Algerian patients were reluctant to sing or perform on a stage during the festivities on the ward. Why? Because they occurred outside of traditional familial or religious context. So too did he come to understand the complex reasons behind their difficulties with narrative abstractions. The thematic apperception test, TAT, asked patients to interpret figurative standardized cards representing diverse social situations, and this was to see how they could interpret ambiguous meanings. However, female Muslim patients did not produce the same narratives as Westerners on whom the test had been developed. And Fanon and Géromini explain, by asking them to describe, to live a scene elaborated by Westerners and for Westerners, we immerse them in a different, foreign, heterogeneous, and non-appropriable world. So they found the TAT to be culturally determined, but rather than defaulting to cultural relativism or racist explanations, they modified the test to include a blank card, which let patients' imagination flow. Gibson and Beneducci write of this discovery. Given their exclusion from the world, the women were humiliated by foreign images. They had no means of recognizing themselves in the test. Concrete participation in the world and in the production of its meanings, that is, the status of being an active subject in the world, is a necessary condition for the development of the imagination. And they argue that Fanon was the first to really develop a truly critical ethnopsychiatry. And here of the test, they write that dynamisms flowing within Maghrebin society, the lived experience of the surrounding European world, the Muslims' marginalized existence, which leads to a Scotomization, a disinterest, the cultural truth ought to have been thematized. Our patient's inadaptation is the correlate of the method's inadequacy. So narrative repair was premised on a predetermined role for language, one that was derived from Western theories. And that's very interesting because Fanon had written very incisively about the dangers of using or adopting Western methods, specifically for Black patients. He talked about the alienation brought on by the French languages for those who were colonized, about how mastering language meant power and how that could result in inferiority complexes. He expected that patients would be able and willing to articulate an illness narrative, but this relied on ideas of the self construed as individualistic. So his clinical investments were really about strengthening the ego and self-determination. In contrast, he noted that in the Algerian context, culture was seldom written. Teaching was carried out orally through speech. The Taleb, public writer of letters, tasked with reading and writing for the rest of the group, played a crucial role as a collective storyteller. He who goes from village to village spreading news and stories from folklore, relating the events of previous centuries, and thereby ensures a cultural liaison between the different regions. As well, cultural attitudes of the Maghrebi Muslim involved extending social trust to those afflicted with illness. And this was really different from what Fanon had experienced practicing in the European context. He writes, "The collectivity never adopts a distrustful or aggressive attitude towards the patient himself." So Notre Journal is instructive about powerful myths, right? The Western narrative construct that Fanon favored really undermined the respect for culture and community that are hallmarks of his psychiatry. And yet Fanon insists, we are dealing with very determinate persons, and as therapists, we have to take these persons and all their nuances into consideration. We must necessarily adapt to each patient. So I argue that putting this in application compels us morally to get at the particular of the patient situation. And scholars of post-colonial and social thought remind us that narratives have been used to construct ideas of difference and ingrain ideas of others as inferior. On the need to scrutinize narrative forms, Dipesh Chakrabarty notes the problematic search for autobiographies in colonial India, which yielded no corresponding conceptions of narrating the private self. There was no endlessly interiorized subject or autobiographies in the confessional mode. So conceptual categories, he argues, coming from a European Enlightenment are woefully inadequate for representing non-European life worlds. It's important to do away with these misrepresentations of colonized people and how they see, think, and represent themselves. And I'll conclude by saying that I think it shows the importance of critical scholarship in the medical humanities and that it ultimately can improve care for patients. And a plug, the results of this research are published in depth in the journal article in the Journal for Medical Humanities. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. Writing therapy is such an important and fascinating topic. And I just have to say, as a First World War historian, how impressed I am you were able to link Wilfred Owen and Frantz Fanon. I'm going to steal that for my teaching, so thanks so much for that. I get to introduce our final panelist today for this panel is Greg Eghigian, who is a professor of history and bioethics at Penn State University. He has written extensively on the history of psychiatric and psychological practices and concepts. He's published several monographs, and I'll just recommend one in particular, The Corrigible and the Incorrigible, Science, Medicine, and the Convict in 20th Century Germany with University of Michigan Press. His latest book, which will appear in June with Oxford, is After the Flying Saucers Came, A Global History of the UFO Phenomenon. And he's working on a new book called Carried Away, Truth, Trust, and Trauma in the Alien Abduction Phenomenon. And I'd just like to vote for Greg for the coolest title award for the conference. because the title today is so intriguing. Alien Traumas, A History of Debate Over the Alien Abduction Experience.
I shouldn't get credit for that. UFOs do that for themselves. Yes, so I'll get right to it here. As Jason pointed out, my book, After the Flying Saucers Came, is going to appear in a few weeks, A Global History of the UFO Phenomenon. And coming out of that work, it becomes apparent once you start studying a phenomenon like flying saucers and UFOs. Many different debates and controversies have arisen over the many decades about this topic, but at the core of it has always been this one question: are they real? And if they're real, who are they? What are they, right? It's been a question of truth. There's a saying that's been going around, you hear it a lot more, particularly in the United States in the wake of Trumpism, which is everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but not to their own facts. In a sense, it gets at the heart of what is my next project and what I want to talk to you today about, which is this question of whether any of or either of these statements here are actually accurate. Because in many ways, the phenomenon I'm going to talk about today challenges those kinds of distinctions. And the truth question really gets real, gets embodied, gets to matter morally when you get to particularly the witness, the person, the individual who says, I saw something, I believe in something, right? It's particularly even more so when you deal with the topic of alien abduction. This painting in many ways gets at the heart of something. So this is a painting by David Huggins, a self-professed abductee who was abducted, he said, multiple times in his youth. It's called In My Bedroom. The fact of it being a painting in and of itself tells you something, right? There are no photographs of alien abductions. There are only memories, narratives, paintings, representations after the fact of these things. So the question is, of course, how to get to the truth of it. Now, I don't really have a lot of time right now to go through all the details and descriptions of alien abductions. In 1980, paranormal investigator Scott Rogo basically gives a pretty good synopsis of what by that time had emerged as the kind of standard script for an alien abduction. And really what I'm going to focus on today is this period of the 1980s to around the turn of the millennium. This is the great heyday, if you will, of the alien abduction phenomenon. Just to be clear, alien abduction reports predate this period, and they have not stopped. But this is a particularly important phase in its history I'm going to be talking about here. But here you see in his description that many of the elements that had emerged as a kind of pattern by 1980. First, some numbers to work with here. So when we're looking at this heyday, the question I often get is this a U.S.-American phenomenon? And the answer I often give is in German, Jein, yes and nein, ja, nein, yes and no. There's no question, all the evidence indicates that it is a more situated, the center of gravity of it, if you will, has been in the United States and in North America, but it is hardly an American phenomenon alone. Gender plays a very important role. While Bullard found it was about a 50-50 proposition, Jenny Randles in the UK found it more like 2/3 of the abductees reporting were women. Sociologists who've studied abductee groups and communities have found there to be more like similar to Randles, about a 2/3, 1/3 representation of women over men in these organizations. That's going to play a factor in a bit here. And then age seems to be relevant in that a goodly many, disproportionately younger people are the people who report being alien abductees here. Now, before getting to the abductees, it needs to be talked about the people who, in the wake of the first flying saucer reports in 1947, there were people who were coming forward already starting in the early 50s and throughout the 60s who said, I have actually met these beings, these aliens from other worlds who are here visiting us. And they earn the moniker the contactees. There's a lot of things to talk about when you talk about the contactees. I only, for our purposes, want to focus on a few things. First of all, take a close look at them. They were overwhelmingly male. The second thing is they were very outward oriented. They published books, they went on lectures, they got on TV. They were speaking for themselves about their experiences, which, by the way, were overwhelmingly positive experiences with the aliens. Here, however, are different images. These are alien abductees from the 80s and 90s. Oops, I don't know what happened there. How do I go back? Can we get the whole thing? Thank you. Perfect. Thank you. I don't know if that was my fault. In any event, here we have abductees in two cases, the bottom one on the left and the one on the right. You have abductees who are reporting to somebody under hypnosis, with the idea that they were going to recover memories that had been buried by the aliens through their use of coercive telepathy. I think the body language here is fascinating in and of itself. But here we have something going on that is a very different thing, where the contactees were very outward oriented. These are all inward oriented, right? This is all people being very internally oriented, asked to share information, often in very vulnerable positions, I might add, with, of course, a male who is looking on and asking questions. But of course, just look at their body language, right? The listening, consoling figure here. And that becomes, I think, plays a very critical role in the alien abduction phenomenon, is the role of what I call the consoling consultant. Self-appointed individuals. Two of the most famous during the 80s and 90s was Bud Hopkins, an artist who some of you may know of, and David Jacobs, a historian. Notice, I'm not talking about clinical psychologists or social workers here. These are not people who have degrees or any special training in therapeutic work. These were self-appointed figures who took it upon themselves to start working with people. And the role of the consoling consultant that they develop, and they're not the only ones who develop it, is they offer support. Many of them help to found sort of support groups and networks. They also saw themselves as investigators, forensic specialists trying to uncover what the aliens were up to when they were kidnapping people and performing experiments on them. They also saw themselves as therapists who were going to help people deal with the situation, but they were also advocates. They speak for these people. They're actually these people's biographers. Very few of the abductees speak for themselves. They're not the ones who go on lecture circuits or on TV. It's these men, and they are overwhelmingly men. There are some women who also take on this role. So that by the 1980s and 90s, you have an alien abduction scenario that has developed that contains, I think, all of these elements. It's not to say every story includes all these elements. It doesn't necessarily. But nonetheless, it's a set of elements that you see time and time and time again. This is truly a spectacular, bizarre, wild, unusual, exotic set of claims. It begs belief, right? And that becomes really the central question that emerges in the 80s and 90s. Can we believe all this? What do we do with these folks who are saying this, right? And they're coming to us for help, us meaning lots of different people, right? How do we deal with that? How do we navigate that issue? And that's what I want to talk to you about with the rest of my time here. This question of getting to the truth of it. We have no forensic evidence. We don't have photographs. What do we turn to? It's in the 90s that in the 80s and 90s that we see the advocates of and the people who are supporters of the alien abductees come forward with arguments like this. Whitley Strieber himself, somebody who has an experience as well, puts it this way, and I'm not going to read that for you, but notice the analogy that is made with rape victims. That becomes an important aspect to it. The second thing is the link to personal trauma. Bud Hopkins, who I mentioned before, does this much the same around the same time in his work, talks about repressed memory, talks about trauma, and how disturbing memories are sort of swamped under sort of sediments that need to be revealed here. All of this has a history, of course. All of this and in the United States, really two communities had, over the course of the 60s and 70s, are really the core, the most important sort of groups and constituents for recognizing longer lasting effects of abuse or experiences that were disturbing. The most famous, I think, and gets a lot of credit for this, are Vietnam veterans, really neglected in a lot of the literature, and I would argue more important for the abductee community was what feminist groups were doing in recognizing rape as a not just a crime, right, but as something that has long-lasting influences on people. And that language is used. Our friend Mike here, I've got your chart here. Thank you very much for doing that work for me. We see this, of course, the spread of the use of the term trauma in the English language and this precipitous rise. But the key moment, I think, is 1980. It is the institutionalization of PTSD as a diagnosis in the DSM-3 that plays this critical role. Because guess what you start to see in the UFO literature? Post-abduction syndrome. 1986, Ron Westrom, a very influential ufologist and sociologist, introduces this term and says, well, aren't these criteria an accurate description of what abductees are going through? David Jacobs, a few years later, follows up and talks about much the same thing, talks about the fact that, keep in mind, that not only were people in their past having these experiences of abduction and the trauma associated, but they continually actually are getting abducted, right? Many people report being abducted over their entire life, multiple times. And so it's a continuing form of abuse and trauma. The critical figure who comes in and plays a big role then is in the 1990s, this man, John Mack, Harvard psychiatrist, award-winning figure, very well respected in his field, comes out of the field of transpersonal psychology. For folks who, many of you I think are familiar with transpersonal psychology, but a psychology that emphasizes, emerged in the 60s as part of an activist movement within psychology, built around the idea of human potential, transcendence, connection with the wider cosmos, associated with a lot of New Age ideas. He comes to the field and enters in almost out of nowhere and says, I'm talking to these people and I believe them, but we need a new language for them. Let's quit calling them abductees. That makes them victims. I call them experiencers, and to this day, most of them wish to be called experiencers here. His argument is we're going to replace trauma with another concept, ontological shock, that these people are having a sacred experience of transcendence, that in fact, yes, it's disturbing, but if you were to confront God or the divine head on, wouldn't it be a shock to you? So let us quit pathologizing this and let them start to see this as an opportunity for spiritual growth. And there's a huge division now that occurs within the alien abduction community. The people who see it as abuse and trauma, the people who see it as ontological shock. Enter then the psychologists of various ilk. They finally start to chime in. It takes a long time before they enter into the discussion. I think it's because John Mack is in it. Once there's a psychiatrist, a big name in the field, who says, I believe them, that's when they get upset. And so then they start intervening. And they come up with all sorts of explanations that I bet most of the folks in this room with clinical and experimental training would be familiar with, right? From psychopathologies to media contamination arguments to religious studies arguments about there are people who are just prone to seeking higher knowledge or higher forms of experience, right? Hypnosis and suggestion. You see, for those of you who know Martin Orne and Elizabeth Loftus, you're familiar with false memory ideas. There's a whole wide range of different explanations that come in there. So to end it all, really, what I'm interested in doing is not adjudicating the reality of this situation. I'm interested as a historian at how people were trying to adjudicate the truth of this and what it reveals. So if I put to the side the question of the veracity of all this and don't play the game that everybody else has played, but play the game of trying to understand how they were trying to do this, it seems to me you get two different kind of threads. Arguments that say this phenomenon is out of the ordinary, and that is, I'm a victim of alien trauma, a believer, or I'm a witness to something supernatural that's transcendent, right, that's more religious, or this person's a victim of a mental illness or some sort of mental wound, a pathologization of it. Or on the one hand, what you get with a particularly clinical, with experimental psychologists, particularly social psychologists, is this is not out of the ordinary. These are kinds of things and beliefs that people get, or delusions that happen to all of us, that this is not somehow some strange phenomenon, but this is quite normal. But the bottom line is everyone tries to get to the truth of this through trauma. Right? The veracity and trustworthiness of anybody in question, right, gets assessed by trying to verify their sincerity. And how do I verify their sincerity? I verify it through the signs of trauma. The absence of trauma may prove, in fact, that the veracity isn't there, the sincerity maybe isn't there. If there is trauma, they must be sincere, therefore there must be something to it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Greg, and we have time for discussion. I wonder if the panelists could come up here. And apologize, we started 5 minutes late. I hope we can reclaim those 5 minutes. Would that be okay? Yep. Give us 15 minutes for discussion. I'll stand to the side. Okay. We'll highlight you guys.
Just hand him out. Here you go.
Thanks. All right. Questions?
Thank you. I have a question for Brian and Nathalie, but I will just respond to Greg that I was watching a documentary on John Mack last night, so it's good to to see something on him. My question, Brian, is that German civilians moved up to Denmark after the fall of Berlin because they were very much afraid of what the Russian soldiers were doing. So whole families came up to Denmark as refugees. And I visited the refugee camp where there were theaters. And it was interesting to see, and these were families, not just the men, but so there was a lot of cultural activity. But my question is to Nathalie, because now we see in our clinic patients from Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria. And when I ask especially the women on do you have any hobbies? What kinds of activities do you like doing on your free time that is for you, that does not maybe involve the children or your husband? That is very hard. So I was wondering, in terms of what you described, Brian, about how natural it is for these German nationals to come up with their cultural production, and how it is so hard for the women that we deal with to take out this interest in art or music or literature. Yeah. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, one of the things I didn't really go into, I think I had it on a slide. The Germans at this time, and there are probably Germans in the room right now, considered themselves to be the, quote, people of music. They believe themselves to be the most cultured people in the world, and I have to say that they're doing this by memory a lot of the time. Like, they know these things so well that they're able to just like write it down and share it with everyone else. And so I think the level of education in Germany at the time, when you put that with the kinds of people who were leaving, you tended to have a group that was very familiar with these things, and so it kind of served as a bond. Something that could bring them together. And there were some problems in the camps with people from the lower classes who weren't as familiar with these musical pieces or whatever, and they were pretty much observers. They had to be in the audience.
Yeah, thank you for your question. For me, it brings up 2 points. The first being that in terms of having hobbies or interests, perhaps that's harder to kind of extract from people, but I'm sure they exist and they do have them. But like, I would question the extent to which the notion of hobby perhaps is like very culturally determined itself. So perhaps another way to draw that out. And also, I think it speaks to this kind of like move towards person-centeredness, but also kind of like always asking preferences in a way that I think reinforces a lot of ways of thinking about ourselves and kind of like always curating who we are and what we like to other people. So perhaps more group-based activities, or in a sense kind of drawing from a lot of the cultural knowledge from these particular communities could be helpful, but very interesting.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for a terrific panel. My question is for Greg, and it's a historical question, and it's in terms of your chronology, where does the satanic ritual sexual abuse controversy fit in to this? Like, and what kind of conversations were happening between those two? Because obviously there's stuff about sexuality and trauma and memory there as well. So I was curious to know how they intersect and how they may bounce off each other.
Yes, right. Ritual sexual abuse, satanic ritual abuse, which was going on at exactly the same time as this was going on. What's interesting is, in general, within the sort of UFO and abductee world, I see very few traces of it within those communities engaging with it or talking with it or seeing it related. The people who thought it was related were the psychologists. They're the ones who sat there and said, and I should correct myself, because I think that too also, with John Mack's involvement, the two of those things going on simultaneously is what worried people. This sense that you see among psychologists, again, particularly among experimental psychologists, not clinicians. Clinicians, we know from studies, have shown they're far more receptive to the concept of repressed and recovered memory, whereas experimental psychologists tend to be more skeptical about it. And that's what you see. So they're the ones who tended to conflate the two, and there are big discussions, particularly by the mid-90s. By the mid-90s, there's a big discussion about just that very fact. And in many ways, I think you'd have to say the people who win the day are the psychologists, because really by about 2000, at least this version of the phenomenon as a broad social phenomenon starts to really wane and disappear.
Just to build up for a sec, it's also when the late 90s is when the clinical psychologists and experimental psychologists break up into separate societies. There's a huge civil war in the field, and it blows up at this exact moment. So they're really not speaking.
So hi, thank you very much. I also have a question to the last presenter. Unfortunately, I forgot your name, but I will not forget your presentation. What is the reason behind this this persistent belief in alien abduction? like yesterday, no, 2 days ago was very revealing, learning about the reason behind like these people who hear voices and that they believe in communication with like the afterworld and stuff like this. But what do you think? What is the reason behind this persistent belief now in alien abductees?
That is a really big question. And they're going to get mad at me because people want to break for lunch. So maybe we'll talk about any details here. It's I have to say the way I understand it is that it's a very complex cultural. I like to use the term borrowed from Norbert Elias, and it's a figuration. It's an ensemble of ideas and emotions and aspirations that has religious elements to it, but it also has inspirations coming from certain anxieties about the world. One of the things that plays a massive role in the UFO and alien phenomenon that is born in 1947 is the Cold War. And the Cold War and this specter of global annihilation is something that in part leads to the idea of who might save us? Is there anybody to save us? And in fact, one of the figures to come out with an explanation of the flying saucer phenomenon in the late 50s was the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung. His last book is on the flying saucers. I highly recommend it. It's foundational. And he makes that argument that flying saucers represent, in a secular society, represent salvation from on high, from the one thing we can believe in now, given that we don't have God or the divine, and that's technology. Technology which will kill us, but technology which can also save us. That's a partial explanation.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm gonna try to be very quick. Thank you so much for an excellent panel. I think it's interesting to me to think about trauma in various different contexts and settings, and what trauma does or doesn't do in certain contexts. So you finish your presentation talking about how trauma is this authentic things, like a box of the truth, whereas in Chris's lecture, trauma in colonial or settler colonial context sort of shifts and changes and is doing other things. It's doing many different ideological things, or it's filling a certain gap. It's kind of like a black box or something. So I just wanted you to reflect on that. And Nathalie, I have a very long story to you about Fanon in Tunisia. I really liked your presentation, but we can talk later.
Craig, do you want to go first?
No, please,
okay.
Talk to him.
Yeah, thanks, Lamia. I completely agree that I'm reading trauma here as a kind of black box, as a way of kind of entering into other stories. And I think that's kind of how I approach the history of psychiatry generally, and how I think we should kind of think about the medical humanities. What can it tell us about these other stories? And in this case, I try to pull out some of those kind of political histories of colonialism, of racism, but also of resistance, and use trauma as a way to think through that in a highly unsystematized way as well. But yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you again for a wonderful panel. A couple of quick questions for Brian and Greg. Brian, I'm wondering about this therapeutic function of cultural production. That's a huge theme in the Gulag, for example, and lots of memoirs reflect on when they're transported from, say, a camp that didn't have, that had a very evolved cultural department to one that didn't. Mental health completely plummeted, and it was a really kind of huge lifeline for people. But in the Soviet case, it was that link, very forceful aim of re-education and reform agendas. I wonder if there's anything, if that has such a prominence in your case. And for Greg, I'm wondering about if you might say a bit more about the role of hypnosis in all this. With the particular history of hypnosis and its link with the occult, it seems to be quite a lot to unpack there in terms of, are these consolers also hypnotists? Then what kind of techniques are they using? And just any thoughts you have on that link? Thank you.
So nothing really with reform, but I will say that there were in some of the civilian camps there were people who were very anti-German. They were labeled German, but they didn't see themselves as German. And there was a lot of memoirs talk about this. There was a group called the Black Hand that would effectively go around beating these people up to try to kind of keep the anti-Germans out, to reduce their influence in the camp. And so it's almost like, after the Second World War, prisoners of war, you've got the guy who just joined the Wehrmacht because he had to, and then you've got the Nazis in the camps who are like, no, we are going to remain true to the ideas of the fatherland kind of thing. And so it's almost like you have these groups within the camp that are making sure that there's really one kind of dominant culture. But there's no attempt on the part of the British to kind of re-educate or reform these people, because I think they know that as soon as the war's over, they're shipping them out.
Yes, hypnosis plays a very, very big role, and it becomes part of the controversy. So some of them never really explain what their methods are. One popular one that is developed and spreads throughout the community is developed by a Berkeley professor, professor of engineering, not a clinician, but he develops it, the pendulum method, which is supposed to reveal memories that are being buried. You hold a pendulum, you've got a paper which is yes or no, and you hold it over it and he asks you questions, and then your unconscious that is buried by what the aliens have done to you, will invariably go to the area that's true. And that opens up the floodgate then for discussion, more and more discussion, and then revelation about it. I make the argument that what is going on is a form for many of these people who argue, the abductee counselors who work from that perspective, is they see this as a kind of mental warfare, mental combat, and that the aliens are enchanters. But as I like to argue, the alien abduction, the consoling consultant is their own enchanter. They've got their own magic, and their magic is hypnosis, and we will defeat them. And I've spoken with one of David Jacobs about his work, and he saw himself that way, as somebody who was going to defeat these evil beings who were playing and experimenting on human lives. I think it needs to be said, in fairness too, these people who are having these experiences, or at least remembering these experiences, are also being experimented on by these consoling consultants, who oftentimes, again, do not have any kind of formal training. Many of them do get trained in hypnosis, but that's where it's left off.
I'm getting the time's up signal from the people who own the microphones. But I want to say thank you so much for a wonderful panel. And for those of you, tell me to stop it.